Hi guys. Hi guys. Today I'm going to talk about classical education versus Charlotte Mason. And I do realize that this can be a controversial topic because feelings run really deeply when anyone starts to mention classical homeschooling or classical education. And I think it is the one method of education that I think sparks controversy or deep feelings or deep emotions with people. I realize when I ask people, what do you think about classical education? I either get a very positive, like, I love it, it's so good for my kids and it's just changed their lives, to I hate it. So there's these opposite ends of the spectrum, and emotions seem to run really deep with that one particular method. And I have a feeling it may be because this is the one method that I know of that tends to reach beyond pedagogy and into more of a spiritual realm through philosophy. Okay, so it can really touch us holistically, and I think you can look at classical in a couple of different ways, but the deeper you get in and the more you incorporate that into maybe have more of a spiritual or Christian slant to it, it can really touch some deep run feelings with people and cause people to just, you know, feel very defensive about the method in and of itself. And so I don't know, I guess I'm just here to maybe unveil as I process through the differences between Charlotte Mason and classical. I thought I would do a video to share with you what I'm learning, and to let you know off the bat that I am not pro or against classical. Actually, I won't say I'm not pro, but I'm not against classical. Okay, let me put it that way. And I'm not against Charlotte Mason, because those of you who have been around my videos long enough know that I talk about Charlotte Mason all the time. So I'm wanting to put I want to even the playing field here, and I want to put them both just up, you know, with one another, and talk about each of them equally and give each of them a chance, because I think that maybe over the years I've been influenced negatively against classical, and I don't want to continue that mindset, because I feel like there's so much good in the classical method that I can extract from that. And I always believe you can learn from anything, from any source. And so take what works for you at that season of your life and see what works for your kids. I have one child who's very bent toward learning classically, and so I have another who I'm not so sure she is. So, you know, it just depends on what your children need and at what season of their life they need. So I'm definitely considering implementing some classical strategies into our home, a classical method. That said, I do want to talk a little bit about the differences, or maybe the similarities between the two, because Charlotte Mason to me has always been freeing, and when I've viewed classical, I've felt the opposite. And that's just being honest, because over the years the way I got into classical education was not the best way to be introduced to classical method. And so I'll share with you how that happened. When I first started homeschooling in 2007, my daughter was in kindergarten. It was my first year homeschooling, my first time ever learning about homeschooling. And I was pregnant. I was like 7 months pregnant, and I was tired, and I had joined this co-op, my very first co-op, and a lot of the people at the co-op were using classical. So they introduced me to Susan Weisbauer. I devoured her book, The Well-Trained Mind, and I just purchased everything in the book, like almost everything that it requested for or suggested for kindergarten and first grade. I ordered all that stuff. I got the Kingfisher's encyclopedias and all of the little books, everything. And I got myself a timeline, and we started to study history chronologically. We got the story of the world, all of it. We did the whole 9 yards, and I was tired. And so that first experience for me, it was burnout, because I was trying to follow this method according to some of the suggestions laid out in Susan's book. And it had nothing to do with her not giving good suggestions or not being easy about it. It was just me taking all of it and wanting to shove it into my life for that one moment. So because I got burned out on it, and my daughter didn't, by the way, she liked it. But because I got burned out on it, I kind of I did a complete shift. And I felt like, okay, classical is not for us, you know. And so I sold the book to a friend, and I just said, you know, I'm done with classical. And I had a bad taste in my mouth about classical education ever since. And of course, you kind of attract like-minded people. So if I said that I didn't really like it, and I'm around others who didn't really like it, we would all have this discussion about why we didn't like classical. And so, you know, birds of a feather flock together, and you just end up with a bunch of people that feel the same way you do, and you end up complaining together. So over the years, what I did was I kind of did a complete flip, and I turned to a more gentle approach. And I thought that classical was not gentle, but that Charlotte Mason is. At this point, I'm beginning to reconsider that idea, because I think it's all about how you approach any theory, any way of doing education. It's how you approach it. If you approach it gently, it will be gentle. And the theory itself and the pedagogy itself is not what is necessarily the problem. It's how we approach that. And so I'm going to go over a few of the similarities that I see between the two, because I'm really surprised. I didn't expect to see that Charlotte Mason and classical could be holding hands on some things. And to be honest, Charlotte Mason got a lot of her ideas from classical method. Now, there are some discrepancies, but just to be perfectly honest, they kind of she's kind of hinging on some of the classical method in a lot of what she talks about in her materials. If you go back and read some of the core philosophy that she has and where she gets that from. So let me go back and talk just more or less about the academic parts of it, and I won't get into at the moment like the spiritual side of things, because you can take that to another level if you're wanting to implement Christian classical method or Christian Charlotte Mason. That's, to me, has a different flavor, and you add what you want to that for your family according to your faith. But I'm just going to talk about the core academics. So with Charlotte Mason, some of the tenets of that, and you can go back and look at some of my videos prior where I talked about Charlotte Mason, but she believes that education is an atmosphere. She believes in the discipline of children, teaching them good habits. So discipline them to create and maintain good habits daily. And that includes some memory work. It includes also just kind of the care and keeping of themselves and of their environment. So habits is important. And then education being an atmosphere is just more or less, you know, life in education is a smorgasbord of wonderful things that your kids can feast on. So their brains can feast on these wonderful ideas. And so she talks a lot about picture study and poetry, study and memorization. So she's really into the arts, showing like a picture and having your kids observe that picture for a short period of time, and then talk about what they feel about that picture and narrating it. So narration and copy work are huge. Narration, copy work, and dictation. Those are three things that you will hear a lot in Charlotte Mason. It's basically narration is your kids telling you or narrating back to you what they've learned. So you read them a story or they read something, and then they tell you in their own words, they're summarizing to you what they've learned. So it's a form of writing, but it's a short little snippet of how they've learned. They're sharing that with you and summarizing it. So they're getting good summary skills, I guess, summarization. Dictation is when you read a passage and they write as you are reading it. So word for word, they hear what you're saying, and they have to then translate that to paper and be able to check their spelling, and as they're writing it, get that punctuation in there correctly. So that is a higher level of grammar skill, and they have to be a little bit more logical to be able to dictate. So that goes, so she would recommend that in higher grades. But initially she starts with copy work. Copy work is when your child just looks at the sentences and copies it down. So there's a lot of that for handwriting practice, and you integrate handwriting with some of the other subjects, and you just kind of get it all in. You look at you do picture study or poetry study, and maybe copy the poem, and that's your handwriting. And look at the picture, observe the picture, and that would be your art study for the day, art appreciation. And then maybe you can narrate something about the art, things like that. And so French and poetry and nature study and getting out in nature, drawing what you see, those are all wonderful aspects of the Charlotte Mason method, and how to go about teaching. And so some of that is grammar's in there a little bit, and you've got art and history and all these things that are woven as well. I believe Charlotte Mason believes in with history, with the approach of history, it's chronological. They use what's called a century of books, I believe. And so you're looking at things picture-wise. So if you are a visual person, you have this century of books, and that's your timeline. Similarities with the classical method. Classical educators also introduce history chronologically. They use a timeline rather than a century of books. They use a timeline. And as far as grammar, there are some huge differences there as far as language arts and grammar and how that is approached. I'll get to that in a moment. Whereas Charlotte Mason really focuses on more of the liberal arts, like I said, art, music, French, art, picture study, handicrafts, things like that, in addition to your grammar and writing, which you get a lot from narration and dictation and summarizing. Charlotte Mason, one of the big differences is that Charlotte Mason does not believe that children are receptacles for information, and that children should not have information kind of shoved into them. And whereas with classical method, the grammar stage dictates that you give them a lot of information, and that info and those tidbits of unrelated pieces of information will be used as pegs upon which children can hinge their ideas and information later on and learn more that way. So they're soaking up info as sponges when they're in the grammar stage. Then when they get to the dialectic or the logic stage, they're able to ask questions about what they memorized in the grammar stage. And then when they get to the rhetoric stage, then they're teens by this point, they'll be able to create a masterpiece thesis and debate their way through their whole, and hold their own, in a very decent intellectual conversation. And so I love listening to classical students, high schoolers who know what they're talking about and why they're talking about what they're talking about, because they're very, very, very intelligent young men and women. So that's kind of the difference, I think, between them, and some of the similarities I gave you. I think with Charlotte Mason, she does focus a little bit on memorization, because there's some poetry memorization. And of course, she does encourage that kids memorize their multiplication facts. So those are like the basic things that you want to remember, right? But it's light because, again, she's not about again, your kids are not receptacles of, for info. So she's very light, and it feels lighter. Okay, I'll just put it that way. It feels like a lighter approach for many people, and I think that's why so many people are embracing Charlotte Mason, and why people feel encouraged to go down that road. I do want to, on the other hand, give props to classical education, because there is strategy, and there's an analytical approach and strategy to how classical education works. It's very methodical, and it actually works for many people whose children have gone through classical education. It works for them, and I appreciate that. Actually, a lot of the curriculum that I've been using over the years is classically inspired. I interviewed Lori Detweiler from the Veritas Press a couple of months ago on my podcast, Christian Homeschool Moms Podcast. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link for that. She has been a classical educator for a very long time, and she and her husband own Veritas Press, and I have always enjoyed their curriculum. I love Memoria Press. I love, we've used Song School Latin. A lot of the Latin curriculum I get from the classical publishers, and I do see the importance of learning classically. So one thing I want to add before this gets too long, this is already a very long video. I thought I could squish it all in, but I can't. One thing about Charlotte Mason is that also I forgot to mention the nature walks. It's not always possible for people. So what folks tend to do is go out in nature or go outside of their house and find like a flower. Is what I would do. Find a flower or plant and then have your child to emulate that, or to copy it down, or to draw it, okay, basically. But one thing I do appreciate about classical is that there is, again, that methodology. So when you're teaching grammar or language arts, what you're doing is you're throwing out the information, and the kids are hanging onto those pegs and putting information on each of those pegs. I love that in classical education, your kids are actually learning how to formulate good paragraphs, and they're learning composition. I don't see in Charlotte Mason, maybe it's there, I just haven't seen it yet, but I don't see the formal teaching of composition the way I do in the classical method. And so I highly appreciate classical method for that, because I know we've used IEW and it has been super helpful for my oldest daughter. Her writing was much better because of it. We also use the Lost Tools of Learning, which is also very classical heavy, and my oldest daughter thrived on that. And because of that curriculum today, she used it in 8th grade, she's now going into 11th. Because of that curriculum, her writing is so much stronger, and she understands how to break down those paragraphs and her thesis and all of this into a really cohesive composition. She writes really well because of the classical method. So I have to give the classical method its props. And also, similarly to Charlotte Mason, I believe in the lower levels, kids are encouraged to do copy work and dictation. It's the same, I think, with the younger years, which would be grammar stage. In classical, as in Charlotte Mason, lots of copy work, lots of dictation, lots of narration, same idea. But as kids get older, it becomes a lot more formal in classical. And so I do appreciate that formality, because when kids do hit what's, I guess, called the part of the trivium called the dialectic, or I'm sorry, the rhetoric stage, that's when our teens are ready to really start formulating their ideas and putting those paragraphs together to make perfect sense, So again, I appreciate the approach to composition and to grammar, especially in the dialectic and the rhetoric stages of the trivium and how that is presented. For a long time, I would say, I don't really believe in the trivium, and that was how I felt about classical education, because again, I was really burned out from the approach that I took with classical when my kids were younger. But the more I study the trivium, the more educated I become about it, I realize it's not something that I can't just choose not to believe in. It is a method, and it is a way of viewing these different stages of a child's learning. And so I chose to ignore that for a long time, but I'm beginning to see how maybe there is something to that. right? And being a child development major, I do know that there are stages of children's lives that where they have those windows of opportunity to really soak in things, and they go from one stage to the next, and you just have to be ready to move along with them. So I'm really beginning to appreciate that more so now. And I don't quite see that with Charlotte Mason. So I'm thinking that either I'm missing something, or I just don't see where kids are when they're ready for the next stage. What is that next stage in CM in Charlotte Mason? So if you know something I don't know about that, inform me, because I am always constantly learning. Like I said, I'm totally into, I love Charlotte Mason, but I'm beginning to see where the need for structure as my kids get older is super important. And I appreciate anything that will help me to better educate my kids. So, oh, and one more thing I want to mention about grammar in Charlotte Mason that kind of threw me for a little loop is that when, I believe Charlotte Mason believes that children will automatically learn how to make good compositions, to write well, simply through being immersed in good literature. I think I will question that and the validity of that statement, because I don't feel like it's enough for my kids to simply read good literature and then be able to suddenly be good writers. I think there is some structure that has to be in place, and some constant habit of writing, not just copy work and not just dictation and narration, but actually being taught how to write, how to compose, you know, how to make a composition, how to write an essay. You know, there's different types of writing. There's expository writing, there's narrative writing, there's also creative writing. My kids love creative writing, but they can't always do creative writing. They need to also know how to do expository writing. So how do we teach them these things? And so that's where I've leaned back on classical curriculum like IEW, which I think is spurred from the classical ideology, or he has that mindset of structure and laying the foundation block upon block, precept upon precept on teaching writing to our kids. And so he used to once be a violin instructor, I believe, so he understands that whole habit and creating habits and laying foundation and practice, practice, practice. And so those regiments are not a bad thing, and they're not something to run away from. But yeah, it's definitely a little bit different than Charlotte Mason in that way. So that's one of the differences. One more thing I want to add is that when kids are younger, I think Charlotte Mason is just really, it has my heart for the young kids, because it is gentle. There's no homework, there's short lessons. Education is a discipline, that you fill the environment with good books. I really believe in that for younger kids. But as my kids are getting older, I'm seeing the need for some a little bit more discipline, a little bit more of teaching concepts, and just in a different format. So I will be kind of combining Charlotte Mason with classical, or seeing how that can even work. And yeah, that's going to be my new journey this year as I start to grow into the stage of my last 2 years with my daughter with high school. She has her junior and senior year coming up, and we've got some changes on the horizon for her. And then with my 10-year-old going into the 5th grade. So I think that is all I want to share on this video. And if you have any questions for me, let me know. I have a lot more I wanted to say, but this video is way too long already. So let me know if you have any questions, and I can come back and do a part 2 on like similarities and differences, because there were a few more things I wanted to discuss, but it's just too long of a video now. All right, thank you so much for watching. Bye.